going to begin with the introduction of our panel members. We're really honored to have these two members who served on the California Reparations Task Force. Donald Tamaki has spent his legal career ensuring that legal services are available to underserved communities and that justice, no matter how long delayed, will be achieved. He was on the legal team that successfully overturned the conviction of Fred Korematsu, who in 1944 challenged the incarceration of 125,000 Japanese Americans before the Supreme Court. Dr. Cheryl Grills is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at Loyola Marymount University. She serves on numerous commissions and projects addressing mental health disparities, social determinants of health, positive youth development, and COVID's impact on communities of color. Dr. Grills planned to be with us today, but family matters prevented her from traveling to Sacramento. She nevertheless did not want to miss this opportunity to speak to you, so we are thankful and honored that she is here with us on Zoom. So let's begin now with some background information about the task force. So Dr. Grills, can't hear you. Oh. Hello. So Dr. Grills, I wanted to first get some background information about the task force, particularly the report. So the task force consisted of 9 members who were appointed by either the governor or the state legislature, and both were appointed by Governor Newsom. So would you explain why, I guess I'll start with you, Don, would you explain why you sought to be appointed to the task force?
Thank you, Donna. Is my turn on? Okay, got it. First of all, welcome, Dr. Grills. We bonded over 2 years in the task force. I learned so much from her, which I'll contribute to this audience. I want to thank the California Museum for putting this on, the JACLs and the Time for Remembrance folks who organized this event, and for you all who, on a Super Bowl weekend, have chosen to come out and hear Cheryl and I. Gotta say, your presence here is more important than ever. The Constitution is being challenged like no other time in modern American history. And regrettably, the rounding up of Japanese Americans certainly remains excruciatingly relevant. I would add to that, it's directly related to our history. I'll call it a racial pathology that certainly began long before Asian Americans arrived on these shores. So we'll talk about that. To answer, Donna, your question, so as everybody remembered, Mr. Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020. And within 4 months, the California legislature passed a bill sponsored by then Assemblymember Shirley Weber to create a task force to study the harm of slavery. The task basically was document 246 years of enslavement, another almost 100 years of Jim Crow exclusion, and decade after decade after decade more of discrimination leading to today's outcomes. And we, after 2 years, on June 29, 2023, submitted this massive 1,100-page report, basically connecting the dots as to why our past explains our present. I did not apply to be on this task force. The task force by legislation required to be 5 appointed by the governor, 4 appointed by the state legislature. I got a call from the governor's office asking, if I would be submitted to an interview. I actually said, I think there are some folks that are more qualified than me, and I submitted their names. A couple months later, they said, no, we want to talk to you. So I hesitated, and it was difficult. Do you want me to explain that? Okay. Well, far be it from me to serve on a task force making recommendations for how to ameliorate the harm to Black Americans. That's what my first thought. But I think Cheryl can relate to this too. I felt a debt is owed. Okay, the country owes a debt for the enormous wealth extracted from this population for 2.5 centuries, and the privileges and profits that extended long after slavery's end. I think the second debt is that people of color owe a debt, in particular to Black activists, many of them young people, high school, teenagers, who at their personal physical peril broke down the doors of Jim Crow, allowing for everybody else to walk through them, including Asian Americans, women, other people of color. Name your disfavored group du jour that's benefited from that. I think the third thing is Japanese Americans in particular owe a debt to Black leaders who stood up to our request for help to pass a reparations bill, when it would be far easier for them to ask the question, what about us? But instead, Ron Dellums, Mervyn Dimerling, some of their pictures were depicted up here, Yvonne Breakaway Burke, leading the Congressional Black Caucus to support this bill. And so, as our community, folks in this room, we owe a debt to that. We need to recognize the connectedness of that. And so it is time for some reciprocity, I think, on our part.
I'll add my 2 cents to that as well.
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, like Don said, and like was the case for Don, I didn't seek out being on this task force. It was definitely not something I felt that I was an expert in. I'm a psychologist, although I spend a lot of my time referencing history to understand the current mental health issues and challenges faced by people of African ancestry and people in general. So I was approached by the governor's office and asked if I would be interested in being interviewed and reviewed to be on this task force. And I did it for a number of reasons. One was personal. My family was directly impacted by the things that reparations is designed to address. My grandfather was a sharecropper, and his family was under the heavy weight and oppressive reality of sharecropping until he was eventually able to free them from that condition when my mom was, I guess, in her early teens. My mom picked cotton. So this idea that this is stuff from way back in the past, it's just not the case. And I remember all of her many stories about what it was like growing up in South Carolina during Jim Crow. And I felt I owed it to her and to my grandfather to step up and take the baton and do my part. I did it for another personal reason. My grandson, who at the time when I was thinking about whether I would do this or not, he was 3 years old, and at the tender age of 3, had his first experience of racism where he was punched in the stomach by a little white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white boy who was jealous that my grandson could do something at the Y better than he could. And the pain of seeing that, of witnessing that, the pain of watching my son, his father, come to grips with, and now it started. And I couldn't protect my child from this. I owed it to them. And I also did it for the generations yet to come. It's like, enough already, America. Been there, done that. Get over your issues with race and confront it and work through it so that all human beings can be seen as for their humanity. I'll put it that way. But I'll also say that I did it because repair is really the only way to fix what has happened. It's a way for us to get out of this oppressive reality that we've had to endure across generations. And it's a way for us to acknowledge the truth of what has happened and the necessity of what needs to come. And I'll finally say that, Band-Aid solutions, their time is over. And that's what we've been experiencing in this country when it comes to the treatment of people of African ancestry. It's been nothing but a series of Band-Aid solutions. And so reparations became a chance for America to fess up, to be honest, to be courageous, to be who it says it is, and to address the striking reality that folks like W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm X, observed. Du Bois said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. That has been our reality. And Malcolm X said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that made the blow. And they haven't even pulled the knife out, much less healed the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there, Malcolm said. That's why I said, yes, I must do this work. And I must do it because we have the right and the need to fight for freedom and for the right to call our souls our own. And so that's how I ended up spending 2 years sitting often side by side with my comrade.
We're so glad that both of you were on the task force. So the task force in June 2023 issued its report. The executive report is 1,100 pages. The executive summary is 55 pages, and there were over 100 recommendations. So it's pretty hard or impossible to talk about all that was in the report in this forum. But can you tell us what was your initial reaction when you read the report, and what kind of impact did it make on you? And Don, if you don't mind, we'll have you start, and then Cheryl, you can join in.
Well, just in terms of some framing, I'm sure this wasn't Cheryl's situation. Certainly, it was mine. I thought I was well read in American history. I thought I knew something about American history. And out of the 1,100 pages, I've read every single page. We've read drafts of every single page. The task force members helped in the revising and the research of some of that work. And I spent half the time crying and the other half screaming, because I did not realize how thoroughly our history, our systems, how our society is rife with this racial pathology that put on layer after layer after layer. So that was one eye-opener. And most people, you know, frankly, they think about slavery, they regard it as a bygone era, something that happened a long time ago, has no relevance today. And so my understanding was limited, you can imagine, about what the common, you know, average American is. I think a second sort of eye-opener was how I viewed Asian American history. You know, every group tends to view their own predicament in their own silo. And I did too. You know, when I talk about Korematsu versus the United States or the Japanese American incarceration, I kind of start with 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I talk about the, you know, the California and West Coast passage of alien land laws, and then leading up to the racial hysteria, you know, ending, you know, leading to this roundup, and to the point that even the Department of Justice, the highest levels of our legal system, they knew they were wrong, and yet they lied in order to manipulate the outcome of these historic Supreme Court cases. So I thought it was, you know, its own chapter. Well, turns out this is really a subchapter in a pathology that began long before we arrived on these shores. Slavery has existed for thousands of years, but white Europeans invented a new kind of slavery that was based on skin color, that was permanent, that was multi-generational, that was inheritable. And it perpetuated a system that created enormous wealth. And if you can subordinate and dehumanize an entire population to that level, then when it comes to any other group, let's say the roundup of Japanese Americans, it's easy, folks. It can be done without a second thought. It can be viewed as completely normal because that racial pathology, that template is set. And so that was a sort of a new view of how I view this now that I've looked at the whole panorama of history. It's all connected. It's part of the same thing. And that's why it continues to recycle, even in today's world. You know, when a new president comes in and declares Asian Americans are the source of the Chinese virus, or Mexicans are drug dealers and rapists, and Muslims are terrorists, and Jews and immigrants are poised to replace good white Americans. So this is something that continues to recycle. I think the question we have to ask is, where does it come from? It comes from an origin. And that origin is not 1942, it's not 1882, it's 1619. In fact, you could trace it back to European colonialism. There's a value system in which all of this stuff that propped up all of the reverberating consequences throughout the year, so throughout the decade, the centuries. So in that respect, when we look at reparations, and this was the eye-opener to me, it's actually a unifying concept. I mean, there's no equivalence between 4 years in a concentration camp that our community experienced and 400 years of oppression. But we do have something in common. Japanese Americans know something about mass incarceration and profiling and the consequences of that. And it's just a subspecies of something that began long before we even got here. So I think if we view that in that respect, then there's a reason for all of us, whatever background you have, to start looking at this. Okay, get to the root of it. Dr. Grills talks about Band-Aids. She's right. We have to cure the body here, not just put a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, you know, as I thought about your question, I'm remembering the process that we actually went through. And for a number of us on the task force, and I would say probably especially me and Don, It wasn't a process where we sat down and read the report. We actually were actively writing it. But there was something to be said for then stepping back when we had to then review the totality of the report and make edit suggestions, etc., that I had the opportunity to have the aerial view. And like Dawn, I thought I knew a little something about Black history, about African American history, about African history. But oh my God, it was truly gut-wrenching and eye-opening. And that's from someone who studies and develops interventions for Black racial trauma. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you a couple of examples. Zora Neale Hurston said there's no greater agony like bearing an untold story. The report became an opportunity for us to write that situation, to tell that untold story, and to tell it from our perspective, not from the perspective of the colonizer, the oppressor, or the enslaver. So the first impact that the overall report had on me was that it gave me a panoramic view. And it was a panoramic view of the elephant in the room. Because I think, particularly the way America teaches us about our history, and when I say our, I mean American history, not Black history, is to give it in little snippets and little pieces and to definitely water it down. And so we began to get this panoramic view that was not watered down, where you could see the totality of the elephant. We could see the many pieces of the assault. Because up to this point, I could see a wound here in education, a wound there in healthcare, a wound over there in denied access to wealth production. But with the report, it was the fullness of it all, the immensity of the elephant that was at the same time validating and overwhelming and painful. There were times I just cried. I would just be reading and I'd have to just step back and just let the emotions flow. Once I kind of got past that, then it was actually the details in the devil that really impacted me. I unfettered saw how mean, how cruel, how inhumane, how unjust the tactics were that America and that California used to keep Black folk down, to keep us oppressed. Doing things like seizure of land, like redlining, like what they did, burning down homes and forcing people out of their homes in Palm Springs in the Section 14 scenario, like the burning of a Black family's house with the family in the house who perished in that burning, like the presence of white supremacy in California, like the KKK, and how the KKK had infiltrated every single layer of society, city, county, state government. I mean, there was one town in California where we got the stats and we could break it down, and 2/3 of the fire chiefs were members of the KKK. 5 of the first 8 mayors of the town were KKK. 6 of the 10 councilmen on the board of trustees were KKK. Half of the treasurers, engineers, clerks, and marshals were KKK. It was like the infiltration into the fiber and fabric of society was just, simply overwhelming. And like the psychological terror and the diabolical attacks on the integrity and the viability of the Black family and the removal of Black children from their homes and placement of children in the child welfare system broke my heart. The collusion of every sector of California life, whether that was healthcare, to government, education, employment, voter suppression, housing segregation and restrictions, unfair law enforcement practices. Everybody got on board. And I marvel at how we were able to survive that. And finally, it was seeing the unmistakable through line, right? There's this through line where the past meets the present, seeing that our past is in fact our present. And again, I'll say Zora Neale Hurston nailed it. She said the present was an egg laid by the past that had the future inside its shell. Think about that. You know, people want to talk about, that was way back then. No, that is our current reality. And then James Baldwin said, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. And the report for me then became a mandate to plot our escape, a collective, all hands on deck across California escape.
Thank you, Cheryl. You know, there are comments and critics who may say, well, California wasn't a slave state, so why should we be leading the charge for reparations? And a second question is about the cost of reparations. So, Don, would you like to address that?
Sure. So there are about 5 arguments against reparations that you've all seen. 2 of them that you mentioned, Donna, are it's too late. Reparations had occurred a long time ago. There's no enslaver or enslaved who is longer living. It's a terrible situation that happened, but it's too late. And it's a bygone era, get over it. The other one is it's too much. Government cannot afford it. Again, get over it, suck it up. Do what everybody else do, just forge on ahead. And there are reasonable answers to both of those. But let me start by just giving some historical framing. I talked about the origins of slavery being around for thousands of years, but the most extreme version of that being introduced in North America in 1619. And then we sort of go on from there. The Constitution protected slavery from the very beginning, gave southern states outsized political power. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office. 1,800 congressmen representing 37 states were enslavers while in office. And as Dr. Grills had just said, California entered the Union in 1850. The Civil War ended in 1865. But California entered the Union as a non-slave state. So what is the problem? The problem is that California was plenty complicit in the institution of slavery. By 1852, it passed 2 versions of fugitive slave laws that allowed a person escaping enslavement to be chased down even though they had been living in the free state of California. By 1867, Democrats rose to power by proclaiming that they would oppose any law that would make Black people, indigenous, or Chinese people equal to whites. And by, as Dr. Grill said, by the 1920s, California was a strong Klan state with sizable chapters in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Fresno, Riverside, Anaheim, San Jose, all up and down the state. It was normal, folks, for this. So when Japanese Americans arrived, that is the environment they parachuted into. And so, unsurprisingly, a slew of anti-Asian legislation followed. But again, that had an origin that began long before Asian Americans arrived on these shores. That's why it's all connected. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but there is it's a connect the dots process.
Yeah, and I think Don laid out really well some examples of why California. It almost becomes the opposite. Why not California? When you look at all the ways that this state colluded with the both enslavement and then the oppression and denial of rights of African people. And even to the point where it's almost like California wanted to one-up everybody else. So, like with the Fugitive Slave Act, which said if you found someone who was enslaved in your state, you had to return them. But California took it to a whole other level and was even more aggressive than even some states back east. So, I mean, the courts, were acting kind of like our Supreme Court today. You have two different standards, one for white folks and one for everybody else. And California was definitely kind of in that ilk, in that vein. But, when it comes to this issue of paying the debt, I have to ask the question, kind of like Nkechi Taifa, who's a long-standing reparationist, has done. It's like, why shouldn't the great-great-grandchildren of those who, after emancipation, were denied land, leased by prisons as convict laborers, subjected to Jim Crow segregation laws, stripped of the right to vote, forcibly sterilized, relegated to substandard housing, worsened by the denial of credit, known as redlining, blocked from military benefits under the GI Bill, forced into the lowest paying jobs. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So it's like, it begs the question, why isn't it okay to redress those wrongs? And, and then when people start talking about, well, that was a debt for another generation, I have to say, go do your homework. People are not short on talking about stuff that they have no information about. And the reality is that each generation passes its debt as well as its assets on to the next generation. So the heritage, which, for example, white folk in this country enjoy because of their white skin privilege, they benefit from a society, a state, a social structure that was governed by, that was established on the foundation of white supremacy. And you don't hear any of them saying, well, I should pull myself up by my bootstraps and I don't want any of the accumulated assets. All you hear is, I don't want any of the accumulated debt, right? But the reality is also that when you look at American society, each society, including our own, owns a debt. So, question, who owns America's debt? The answer, you do, I do, we all do. In this present moment, the public, the American public, holds over $30 trillion of the national debt. And we have paid on that debt with nobody raising a question. Other atrocities have happened, and this country has paid a debt for it. And no one has said, wait a minute, we can't afford this. Wait a minute, that was not something I personally did. We just paid the debt. But when it comes to black folk, it's like, wait a minute, no, that is not an option. What are we really dealing with? It's not a matter of we can't afford it. It's not a matter of cross-generational debt. It's a matter of anti-blackness. And we just need to call it what it is.
totally agree with you, Cheryl. That's why we got along so well on the task force. Let me follow up with that "it's too much" argument. It's expensive to fix centuries of exclusion, but what is the cost of not doing anything? And I think you can sort of analogize it with some metaphors where society has recognized the importance of dealing with this on the whole. COVID, for example. We've just come out of a COVID nightmare. The cost of PPP equipment, the cost of shutting things down, the cost of lives lost has been enormous. But what if the government had not undertaken vaccines, done what it did to provide cash payments and other things? The cost would have been enormous. I mean, my point is basically, our society is actually very used to very big reparative processes. We view them as societal debts. We don't say, who's responsible for this, who's at fault. They're simply fixed. LA fires will be one of those. Hurricane Katrina will be another. COVID, as I said before. But there's a host of programs that the government routinely engages in, whether it's, I'll list them, black lung disease for farmers whose crops have failed, for coal miners, farmers whose crops have failed, workers whose companies have gone bankrupt, victims of terror, natural disasters, military veterans, individuals wrongly convicted, fishermen facing depleted fish stocks, individuals harmed by pesticides, by toxins, medical devices that are defective, depositors in failed banks is another one, and so on. And as far as cost is concerned, again, all of these are expensive. The war in Afghanistan, not a reparative program, but $1 trillion war. That is $300 million per day, times 20 years. Could America afford that? Arguably, no. So it is one of these things of where is the political will. And reparations currently is defined as, sometimes it's cast as prejudice being individual prejudice, one person against another, and not systems of harm that were designed to actually allocate profits and privileges. And again, referring back to the analogies in which there are reparative programs all the time, lots of our tax dollars go for that, to repair and heal folks harmed through no fault of their own. And I think as we look at reparations, we have to redefine that. Of course it's expensive, but you've got to think back, for those who are old enough in the room to remember, when teachers were organizing to inform the public to put more funds into public schools. And I remember a bumper sticker that said, education, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Indeed, And we're paying for that right now. Think of the cost of doing nothing, whether it's in lives lost. Black people have, on the whole, 6 to 7 years shorter life expectancies, chronic disease, incarceration, public safety, all of these things that are pulling our society apart. The reality of that is the cost is enormous. It is enormous. So I think yes, we have to confront this argument that it's too much. It is expensive. But it goes into all of those things that make a society. So I think I wanted to add that.
Thank you, Cheryl. Was there anything else that you wanted to add about some of these arguments against reparations? Okay.
We'll be here all day.
Let me ask you another question then. So we've started to talk about the harm that is involved. And I think people want to acknowledge that there is harm, but what happens if you don't acknowledge it or have meaningful repair? And Cheryl, I'm looking to you as an experienced psychologist.
So we'll be here till 10 tonight, right? And I can really unpack this. It's really, it's fascinating to me as a psychologist to try to understand and unpack this issue. You know, even though I understand the dynamics of racism and the potential impact it can have on one's psyche, one's well-being, I think it was sitting there for 2 years on the task force and watching not just people who were not of African ancestry grapple with the issues and kind of trying to understand through their lens, like what was going on psychologically for them in what they could and could not see, what they would and would not see. And I think I had an aha moment as I watched, though, some of the African American members of the community show up at task force hearings and make commentary. And one of the things that I think I noticed was the layers of harm that can happen when you are grappling with multi-generational trauma, and how in the midst of the pain of anti-Blackness, it can transform, that pain can transform itself into a level of anger that alters how some Black folks show up, how it impacts relational ties and communal values, and taking a back seat to winning one's own analysis and position is just like not an option. It's like at all costs, my position, my analysis, my demands are the only correct and righteous ones. And in some ways, I was stunned at how I saw almost folks acting in MAGA-like ways, and that was stunning to me as a psychologist and as a Black person. You know, a loose relationship with the truth, being disrespectful, and what might be driving that. You know, that not having a space and a place and a culturally grounded way to unpack and explore and to begin the healing process associated with all of the harm that was done. And it made me think about an analogy from medicine, right? And the depths that we need to go to when it comes to the healing component of reparations. So if you broke your arm today, right now, what's the first thing you would do? I'm hoping you go to the doctor, right? You go to the ER. And what are they going to do? They're going to do some x-rays. They're going to see where there was damage, where there's some breakage in the bone. And then what are they going to do? They're going to reset it, right? So the first kind of phase in the management of musculoskeletal injury is restoration of anatomy. That's healing phase one. But the work is not over, because once back in the day they would put cast on, right? And once they would take the cast off, is your work done? No. So what's the next thing you're going to do? You're going to go to physical therapy, because now there needs to be restoration of functioning. And that restoration of functioning is called the restoration of actually physiology, which is function, is a component that we haven't talked enough about. How do we come together within the Black community and across racial groups to reestablish how we are with each other and walk with each other in this world in ways that respect our dignity, our humanity, our shared experience, and the fact that we are all in this boat together, right? And if we don't, kind of recognize that we're in this boat together, we will sink together. There's a really good story. I wanted to share it, but I can't find it at this moment. That was actually, yes, I can. It was shared by a colleague of mine, Dr. Jaya John, and he said at the deepest core of who we are as beings, our design is to be in relation with each other and all living things. And so he pointed out that when a house is on fire, you direct your resources to putting out the fire in that house. You don't stand back and say, all houses matter. Who would do that, right? When you have a hole in your boat, you don't go around saying, I serve all of the boats. And I serve all of the boat that has a hole in it. You realize that if you do not repair the hole, your boat will sink. And everybody's going to perish. You put your attention and your resources into repairing the whole, which means that everybody who's going to be impacted, needs to be taken into account. You don't worry about the other parts of the boat being, neglected as though they somehow deserve equal focus. You mend the whole, you save the boat. In a hospital emergency ward, nurses and doctors don't respond to patients according to an attitude and policy of artificial sameness. Patients would die. I mean, it's common sense, right? So instead, they turn their attention and resources toward those patients exhibiting the most critical need. That's basic triage work in medicine. So that's the way of reparative work that has to happen. That's the work of justice, and that's the work of discernment that we need to do for those who are most impacted, but for those who are, quote unquote, on the sidelines, who may not realize it, but you're in the boat with us. And we all need to realize that we have a shared experience and a shared mission of repair.
So I'm going to turn to some current events that I think have some, that you will have some comments on, providing some connections to. So in 1981, during commission hearings for the Japanese American incarceration experience during World War II, there were many people who came forward and they shared their personal stories. And when asked, why they're appearing before the commission, many of them said, I'm speaking out so that this doesn't happen again and that history does not repeat itself. So Don, what are your thoughts about what is happening today? And I think during some conversations you talked about a playbook.
So demagoguery is rising not just in the United States but globally. What are the three sort of characteristics of demagoguery? Appeal to prejudice, fear, racism, pander to that, engage and traffic in conspiracy theories, fake news, and use those forces in a way to muster political support in order to become more authoritarianism. And we're seeing that in the United States nationwide. And so a lot of these things are being resurrected, like we talked about the the Alien Enemies Act, and that was an act in 1798, which was controversial even in those days, that provided that there must be 3 requirements in order for it to be invoked. One is a declared war against a foreign power. Secondly, an invasion. And thirdly, the foreign power or country is involved in that invasion. And it's only been invoked 3 times. One in 1812, the second time in World War I, and then of course in World War II, when Japanese Americans, the day after Pearl Harbor, the Secret Service swept into Japanese American communities up and down the West Coast and began to arrest people and be taken away, not to concentration camps, but to jails and stockades and this sort of thing all over the country. And so it's being invoked again for the border issue. Now, you know, you don't have to be a lawyer to say, are we at war with Mexico or Guatemala? No. Is a foreign power involved in an invasion? No. But yet, they're papering it over, government officials, leaders, by saying, well, we do have a war on terror, and therefore that's a declared war, and then some of these countries are complicit in that, so therefore the Alien Enemies Act should be invoked. And so they're test driving a lot of these things. End of birthright citizenship, which has been around since 1896. And so all of these things now are being resurrected and pulled up again. And I did mention things about the old playbook of Asians being connected to viruses and COVID and all of these things and so on. So we see these things over and over and over again. And so in our time, you know, this is the most dire threat that America has ever seen toward its institutions in modern times.
Don, I was also thinking about executive orders and the use of executive orders, because what led to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans was when the President Roosevelt, signed the executive order. And now we're seeing almost executive orders being brought forward every day.
So, not to get too deeply in the weeds on that, but every good civics student knows that we have 3 branches of government: the executive, the presidential branch, the legislative branch, Congress, and the judicial branch, the courts. And in the wisdom of the founders of the country, each branch is co-equal in power, each designed to be a check and balance against the excesses of the other. And it anticipated, it was really intended to be a safeguard against the rise of kings and tyrants. And the practice of the executive orders, one after another, being issued is a concentration of power within the executive. And we talk about bringing on Elon Musk and other very wealthy, influential people as suddenly they're not elected, they weren't approved by Congress, and now they're pulling the levers and the dials of the entire country. And the courts are now beginning to step up and be a check on that. But in contrast, in the incarceration of Japanese Americans, spectacular example where all 3 branches fail to be a check on each other. The president issued Executive Order 9066, and everybody went along with it, including the U.S. Supreme Court. And when that happens, you know, you have a situation where democracy itself is hollowed out from within to a point that you will no longer recognize it. And that's how you can lose a democracy incrementally, And regrettably, we're seeing the first stages of that now.
And I think the idea of a playbook is really very much on point. And we've seen psychologists, prolific and incredibly insightful psychiatrists, I'm talking about Black scholars, who've tried to lay out what were the elements of this playbook. And at the end of the day, it all kind of gravitates to something that we're seeing playing out right now in our country. And that is, you create an environment of intense psychological terror. And so you get people in a frenzy where they're feeling afraid, where they are starting to question who they are and what their place is in the society. And you leave folks with this kind of, this sense of the shoe is going to drop, at any moment. It's just a matter of when. So you're in constant hypervigilance. And it's because America has never really dealt with its original sins. And I say sins in plural because many people of color have been harmed and have been at the mercy of this playbook. And it's kind of like you end up being perpetually in a cycle of vulnerability, where you cycle through this reality that you're free today, you're marginalized tomorrow, depending on who's in office, who's on the Supreme Court, who's in Congress. And so, in other words, there's no sense of stability and inclusion. And I don't think that we have kind of allowed ourselves to come out of the matrix, to take the pill, to see the strategy and the tactic for what it is, and to confront it on its own terms, so that we're not as easily manipulated in terms of our emotions and our feelings and our reactions to the playbook. But I think we have an opportunity in this moment to address this situation so that if you have rights in this country, you have rights, and it doesn't matter who's the president, who's in Congress, who's on the Supreme Court. Justice is justice. Equity and equality are equity and equality. And you can trust that the society is who she says she is, no matter who you are. And I think what is happening today presents us with an opportunity to reckon with that, because we haven't done that reckoning, because we haven't done the education that we need to of what happened, where we are, and where we will end up if we don't address it. And I think America, is showing us where we can end up when you're talking out of both sides of your mouth and you're living a lie.
There also seems to be, the need for conversations. So there's, I think, comments that were made after the election that we just don't know how to talk to each other about where we're coming from. So how do you engage in conversations with people about Black reparations? And what's really required from each person to have a meaningful conversation?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, we have some of the ingredients for the recipe to address our challenges, our cross-racial, cross-socioeconomic, cross-religious challenges. And the first thing we have to do is recognize what happens when you need to say something to someone and it's going to be a difficult conversation. Think about it. I want everybody in the audience to just think about it. Think about the last time you had to tell somebody something or challenge someone or correct someone, how did you feel? We got to start there. We are human beings, and we actually are pretty predictable in how we respond to stressful situations. And it starts with our bodies. Everybody thinks, oh, it's all up in our head. No. Start with your body. When you're getting ready to have a difficult conversation, you gotta first say, let me manage how my body is going to react to stress. Now, why do I need to do that? I need to do that because if my nervous system is all out of whack, if it feels threatened, all communication goes into the toilet. And what I mean by that is the side of the component of your psyche that needs to be kind of in charge is kind of side railed. It's derailed, I'll put it that way. Your social emotional side can't operate because you are in survival mode. That means you no longer hear me. Your empathy goes down the toilet. Your ability to be creative in your thinking is tapped out. Basically, everything that you need to have the critical conversation has just been short-circuited. So the first thing we need to do when we want to have these conversations is to manage our stress so that we can be fully present and not feel like we are in danger. Then the second thing is to lead with our humanity, our empathy, and our commitment to protecting each other's dignity. I can disagree with you, but I don't have to disrespect you. I don't have to make you feel less than. I don't have to chastise you. I simply want to connect with you. And I can do that in a way that keeps us both feeling safe, but also both being honest. The next thing is that I also want to lead with humility, because as much as I think I know it all, actually there's still more to learn. And there's a different perspective always out there that can expand and deepen my perspective. But you can't get there if you don't have a sense of humility. And then the next thing you need to do is to seek to know. There's so much we don't know that we don't know we don't know. Yeah, go down on that rabbit hole, right? And so in that regard, I have to seek out information that, quite frankly, may be intentionally kept from me, which is what we're seeing right now with this rewriting of history, this removal of all kinds of things from history, this warning, don't talk about X, Y, or Z, and let's remove all of this information from the history books. So we have to realize that our starting point is that we are probably ill-informed. That then opens up the possibility for true conversation. And then from there, I think we can begin to connect human being to human being. And I'll end with one last quick thing, which is, some people, yes, we have cultural differences. We have different life experiences and historical realities. But at the end of the day, we're also just human beings. And we are able to connect with each other on that level. So I'm about to tear up because I'm thinking about a story of something that just happened recently. So, my mom passed. Her funeral was just 2 days ago. And one of my ways of coping was to do some retail therapy. Right? Either I was cleaning or I was doing retail therapy just to kind of make it through so I could plan her funeral, gather all the family and all that stuff. And I went to a store to buy a new living room furniture set because my then living room furniture was too painful of a reminder of my mom. I mean, she had her spot on that couch that she sat in every day, like clockwork, waiting for me to come home from work, watching through the living room window. And so she wore away that portion of the couch. So I said, I need a new couch. And I went to the store, and one of the owners of the store is a Japanese-American elder. And I think he could tell something was wrong. And as I was placing my order for the chair I selected from his store, and I shared with him that my mom had just passed, and I needed to, for various reasons, replace my couch. And I said I was hoping I could get it done before the funeral, before the family got in town. And he says, well, it's going to take this many days, and but we're making it in-house. Maybe I can shave off a day or two. Next thing I know, we're no longer talking about the couch, but he's connecting with me as a human being who just lost her mother, telling his story about what it was like when he lost his mother, and then within months, losing his father. And so we're both now teary, we're both sharing our story, we both have different cultural realities about, some aspects of that experience, but we're still connected, heart to heart, spirit to spirit, soul to soul. And I kid you not, I got a phone call, because this was on the weekend when I went to the store. I got a call about 4 days later, and he said, we're going to deliver your couch in another day. Wow. And I was like, what? What happens, look at what happens when we allow our humanity to lead, when we allow ourselves to connect as human beings, but can still at the same time hold space to respect and appreciate our different experiences. That's what we need to get to if we're ever in America going to do the healing that we need to do.
Thank you, Cheryl. Don, did you want to add anything?
How could I follow that? Yeah. Yes. I don't want to.
Okay, we're going to go on to the next question. Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing that personal story, and it's going to stay with us. So maybe this is kind of related. What gives you hope that now is the time to move forward on Black reparations?
I would say that when we started in California, it was just a handful of municipalities that were embarking on this journey. And by the time we finished, I mean, it had more than doubled. And then Liberation Ventures did an analysis when they created what's called a blueprint. And I would encourage everybody to look it up. It's got some really good information in there. But in that blueprint, what we saw was now an explosion across the U.S. of counties, cities, states taking on reparations, where our federal government has been derelict in its duty to respond to requests and pleas for reparations that have been happening since the 1700s in this country. This is not new. We've been at this for a while. You begin to see that there's some traction here. It's fascinating that it's happening at a time, where we've got the kind of current administration and political dynamics in place. But I think that more people recognize the rightness of this than the challenges of it. And not only has it kind of proliferated across the U.S., it has also become intensely international. So that the United Nations in the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent has made reparations a priority. The African Union has made this year the year of reparations. The Caribbean states have taken this on, and they have been just relentless in the pursuit of reparations. And so I think that the heart of people's recognition that right is right and wrong is wrong, and making amends is the right thing to do, that is prevailing. And I think I also take comfort in this poem that I believe it was Trevor Smith that wrote it. I think either before or right after he left Liberation Ventures. And it's entitled Our Inheritance, and it's really short, and it simply says, some of us inherit privilege, some of us inherit hardships, all of us inherit a history of harm. It is our story, we must tell it. It is our song, we must sing it, we must claim it, and most importantly, we must repair it. After all, as Americans, this is our inheritance. So to see more and more people saying reparations is not a black thing, it's an American thing, gives me hope.
Thank you, Cheryl. Don, I'm going to turn to you about one of the recommendations of the task force was to establish a public education fund. Would you please tell us about that fund and your efforts?
Yeah, this is something that Japanese Americans actually know a lot about. Just to add on to what Cheryl was saying, people forget that Japanese American reparations was a 20-year journey. And when that journey first started, most Americans, and I'm talking about highly educated Americans, journalists, politicians, political leaders, were completely unaware that America had concentration camps. I remember calling news desks when we were about to file this petition to reopen Korematsu versus the United States, and the news desk said, "This happened in America? When?" They said, "Aren't these Japanese soldiers who were arrested or rather captured? And isn't this, are they POWs?" And I said, "No, these are Americans." The level of education that's gone on since then has really flipped things. And it led to a 1988 Civil Liberties Act, and people should remember there's two parts of that. One was compensation, but the other one was education. And there was a fund set aside to allow artists, creators, playwrights, authors, movie producers to basically receive grants to educate the public on what happened. And around 1998, the money was depleted, but it had done a tremendous job in informing the American public. So the California legislature, with the support of Japanese American organizations, pushed for a California Civil Liberties education program, which since that 1998 has issued grants totaling $9 million. So most of us who know about something about what happened to Japanese Americans so long ago have learned from the products of that, whether it's websites, curriculum, field trips, programs like this. A lot of that has come out of California. So out of the 115 recommendations for repair, maybe a half dozen or more deal with compensation. Another bunch deal with healthcare, policing, all of that housing. But there is one proposal to create a civil liberties public education program to educate people about what's happened to Black Californians and Black Americans. And Japanese American organizations, JACL, is specially positioned because we know how effective that was in our struggle. And we have to move the needle of public opinion. I 100% agree with Cheryl about empathy and dealing with, not only minds but hearts. In addition, though, and she mentioned this, we have to do the education part, and we have to make that accessible. So this proposal is now being floated by the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, Truth, the statewide coalition that I work with, and Cheryl as well. And so we hope to enlist your support to put your experience and your energy behind that.
There is still so much to talk about, but the clock is ticking and we have a schedule set out for you. So at this time, we're going to open it up to questions and answers, and we do have volunteers who will be passing a cordless microphone in case you have a question. Because we are operating on Zoom, Cheryl will not be able to hear your questions, and so I'm going to have to repeat it as I speak into my laptop so that she can answer the question. So I'm going to apologize in advance that when you ask your question, please try to keep it short, and I'm going to be writing it down and I will be repeating your question. Also, when you finish asking your question, please pass the mic back to the volunteers so we can be prepared for the next question. Okay, so let's begin. Anybody?
Hello there, my name is Kulvinder Singh. I'm a lawyer in Roseville. Don, maybe you can help answer this. I've watched those, Finding Your Roots shows, and black people are not really black. They're all mixed with something. So I'm wondering, who do you pay? Because it seems like there aren't any true black people. When they came, they were from various African countries. They weren't usually, when they intermarried in North America, South America, all from that one African country either. So that's one question. Here's a second question for you. We have had a worse history with the Native Americans. So how do you compensate them?
I think those are fine questions and fair questions to ask. With respect to the issue of race and color and lineage and ancestry, there were 12 million people stolen, kidnapped off the west coast of Africa. 2 million died in the Middle Passage. 400,000 dropped off in North America, and the rest in Brazil, South America, Jamaica, Caribbean, and so on. And with respect to American slavery, it is possible in many cases, perhaps, to be able to trace lineage to those people who are descendants of American slavery. But the other piece of how racism works in this country. And it is color-based, and I don't think Derek Chauvin much cared whether George Floyd was a descendant of an enslaved person or a black immigrant or a mixed race or anything else. And we had this problem too when we were rounded up in Japanese Americans. They had to define, who's really a Japanese American. Plessy versus Ferguson, you're a lawyer, you remember 1896, in which the Supreme Court declared separate but equal. And the conclusion was if you had one drop of African American blood, even though you could trace your ancestry to Europe, you were black, and therefore you were relegated to second-class citizenship. So I think the Reparations Task Force had to address that. And so the sort of delineations you're making were not so drawn so narrowly. They were drawn broadly with the reality of how racism operates. And I'll just leave it at that, just in the interest of brevity. The other piece of it is the what about argument. What about indigenous people that have suffered not only land theft, but genocide, entire populations that we wiped out? And the answer is anyone who's been harmed should be repaired. This is not oppression Olympics. We need to recognize the harms that have happened, and we need to fix those. But the reality too is society can't solve for all the time, all at once. But that doesn't mean that we don't solve for anyone. That means we begin where we can. And this happens all the time. I'll take it out of the race sort of framework and talk about people being harmed generally. The people in California who lost their homes in the LA fires are not going to say no natural disasters relief for the folks in Louisiana until we've been completely repaired. Stand in line. No, America will, and we understand as Americans, the right thing to do is to do what we can. And that means if we have to help victims of natural disasters or other harms, COVID or whatever, we're going to do that no matter who they are and where. And although we may not be able to fix for all the harms all at once, we will begin the process. In this case, black reparations has been long ignored. You could say the same also for indigenous people in particular. So does that mean that one gets a leg up over the other? No, we try to do this as much as we can when we can. And so I think the answer is, to what about is, we have to at least begin the process, and a rising tide does lift all boats, and it creates a precedent to help all people who have been harmed.
Cheryl, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything. The question involved. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question, please.
I was just curious, when Executive Order 9066 was written, were there any active protests in the United States, or did people outside of California, did they have an awareness of what was going on?
Generally, no. You got to remember that Executive Order 906 and the roundup of Japanese Americans was the most popular thing ever. Everybody got in the act. The newspapers, government officials, churches, the National Board of the ACLU issued a directive to all of its local chapters not to represent Japanese Americans. They didn't want to be seen as soft on fascism, and they wanted to get behind the war effort. Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States, who in 1954 led a unanimous court to overturn segregation in public schools, then in 1954. But in 1941, 1942, Earl Warren, the politician, then the Attorney General running for governor, really ran on a slogan that the Japs must go. He was largely responsible, I'd say, for fanning the flames to get Japanese Americans off the West Coast, and it worked. He became the governor of California. Before he died, he expressed his profound regret about his actions. But at the time, this was a really, really powerful thing, a popular thing. Now, there are a few that stood up. American Friends Service Committee did, Quaker organizations. There are pockets of people, white Americans that stood up for Japanese Americans, took care of their property, and protested what was going on. But by and large, demagoguery won out. It was incredibly popular.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Oh, there's one in the back.
Yeah, my name is Ernest Wozek, professor at Sac State. In fact, we have a conference coming up on this topic in April, so I'm glad to be here. I'm wondering, especially Dr. Grill talked about the Black reparations at the both national and international levels. What are some tips, lessons that could be applied across the board for effective and probably successful outcomes that also may minimize some of the possible infighting or divisions that may exist within the different Black groups, if any? Thank you.
So Dr. Grills, the question is, so there's been some success on the national and international level for reparations. And can you give any tips on how to have a successful outcome?
I would say that it starts with actually doing the legwork of compiling the harms and being able to document those harms in ways that aren't challenged. I think that was one of the beauties of our final report, that it was thorough, it was well cited and documented, and it made the case. And then in making the case, then it also becomes important to make sure that that case is being heard by a cross-section of the community, the society. So, and bringing in allies who understand, recognize, and believe in the merits of justice denied is justice deferred. And then making sure that, and I think we could have done better at this in California, ensuring that our elected officials who will be tasked with coming up with actual concrete strategies to implement any recommendations for repair are walking side by side with us, that they're not kind of at the 11th hour stepping in to hear and to learn and to appreciate what has happened and what needs to be done. I also think that we need to be careful about polling. A poll is only as good as the way the questions are framed. And if the questions are not done well, you could come out with inaccurate or misleading conclusions that suggest that the society is not behind you, when in fact very much may be. But you got to ask the right questions in the right way. And again, I can't underscore the importance of alliances. That this cannot be something siloed to a single group, but it is something that has to be collectively owned and collectively pursued, and that we also need to think global and act local. And so if it's a national effort, you still need to do the work of uncovering the local harms. It contributes to making the case, but it also contributes to a sense of ownership of the issue and the needed resolution. And then we connect the dots across different levels of the issue, from the local to the state, to the federal, to the international. You know, because at the end of the day, this is also not an American issue. It is a global village issue that really, I mean, it's got to be understood in that way and approached in that way. And I think if we did that, we could see some really profound changes.
Can I add one other item? Cheryl, part of the question that was asked here, thank you, is how do we minimize conflict in the movement? I don't have an answer for you. I'm not an expert in this area, but I can share with you some experience of Japanese American on reparations. We had huge conflicts, folks, and this internecine battles between groups did occur. Sometimes folks said things that you can't take back, and it was all with the idea that there was one way to get this done, and their one way might be different from the other group's one way. And so, but after how many years of that, sort of looking back, we find there wasn't just one way. Actually, there were multiple pathways that could lead to a successful result. And so I just throw that out there as an observation. It's a piece of wisdom about, and this was true within the civil rights movement too. I'm old enough to remember the battles that had happened between the organizations. So I just throw that out there.
Yes, next question.
So my question